Welcome, Dr. Charles Grob, to the show.
Oh, it's good to see you.
It's wonderful to have you. You're a legend in the field, and when people talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, I think about people like you in this field who've been in it for how long? 4 decades?
Oh, it's been a while. It's been quite a while. I guess our first efforts at a research study was, over 30 years ago, and I had, strong interest even predating that, going back to the early 70s when I stumbled across the psychiatric and medical literature on psychedelics, and was just fascinating.
Wow. And so were you in medical school at that time in the early 70s, or what was
Yeah, well, in the early 70s when I kind of made this unexpected discovery, I had left college, had traveled, was back in New York, had not yet gone back to school, wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and ended up getting a job as a research assistant in a sleep dream research study in Brooklyn at Maimonides Medical Center, the Dream Research Laboratory. And to stay up all night, I needed to read. And one of the investigators, Stanley Krippner, who's still around, he's still a senior professor at the Saybrook Institute in San Francisco. And he was at Maimonides in the early 70s, one of the creators of this study. He had a great library in his office of everything that had been written on psychedelics to date, books, articles, and various kinds of literatures. And he allowed me to borrow. And so this is how I would spend my nights, reading the history of psychedelics. And wow. One night at 3 a.m, I had this, staring at EEG tracings, and reading. I had this epiphany that I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to study psychedelics. So I told my father, who was a physician, and he said, "Well, son," and I explained why I thought psychedelics were so fascinating. They really teach us so much about the human condition, and there are these very, very novel, intriguing treatment models that seem to work for people for whom conventional treatments don't work. So I laid all this out, and he said, "Well, son, there may be something to what you say, but no one will listen to you unless you get your credentials." So then I knew I had to go back to school, which I did. I did my pre-med at Columbia, and then I went to medical school. And but I started medical school in 75, and by then psychedelic research had pretty much disappeared. And in fact, even discussion of the topic was virtually taboo. We had an assignment, I think in second year medical school. So this would have been the fall of 76. Then an assignment to each of us go through the literature, the medical literature, come up with a research article, and distill the article down and present, what was done and what the findings were and what the issues and implications were to the class. So I found Stan Grof's 1973 article in the International Journal of Pharmacopsychiatry describing his work at Spring Grove, Maryland, treating people with terminal cancer-related anxiety and depression with either LSD or DPT, an intramuscular tryptamine. And it was just a very moving article. I was very much inspired by it, and so I created a presentation out of the article. I think I made it pretty succinct and got all the right points across, presented it to my class. Then I stepped back, waited for comments or questions, and there was zilch, nothing, not a sound. You could hear a pin drop. It was, no one wanted to talk about this topic. And then I realized, whoa, I got to keep my interest to myself.
Were you at this time, a young person of like the late 60s, early 70s? Were you actually having experiences with psychedelics, or was this purely academic for you?
Oh, no. I went off to college in 68. And I went to a progressive school in the Midwest, Oberlin College.
Oh, yeah.
And, by the spring of freshman year, I was struck by really the stories I was hearing from some of my friends who had had experience with psychedelics, and I became very intrigued, even though previous I had had no interest to speak of.
Mm-hmm.
But towards spring of freshman year, I had a couple of experiences, a couple more the next fall, and then I quickly realized that while these were fascinating compounds, and I was having very powerful, meaningful experience, taking them within the context of a college dormitory was too unpredictable. And I realized back then you needed controls over this. People needed to be in a protective bubble, and that you couldn't always guarantee that in a dormitory full of 18 and 19-year-old kids. So
it's pretty amazing that you had that awareness at such a young age. I did not have that awareness. But that's amazing that you had that awareness starting to show up, and you were like, hey, this is something here, but we need to contain this in some way to get the most use out of it.
That's right. So, but I got bit by the bug, and I was fascinated with what these compounds were all about. Where do they come from? How were they discovered? How have they been utilized? How were they used by indigenous people, which was a real revelation to have heard that. How were they examined by that pioneer generation of researchers in the 50s and 60s? So I was very interested. And when I came across Stanley Krippner's library, it was, wow, I'd hit pay dirt. This is fascinating material. So I'd stay up every night just devouring all this, all these articles and books, and really immerse myself in what was known about psychedelics at that point in time. And I was at the Dream Lab in 72 and 73.
Now, thank you for sharing the story of your presentation of Stan's research article. That's a fantastic story. I'm curious, after that sort of fell flat in terms of the level of interest in the audience, and you said you had to kind of keep it to yourself. Did your interest kind of go underground for you, or become more private at that point?
Somewhat. I had my own special ritual, which is at the beginning of every month, I'd go into the medical library at my medical school, and I'd go make a beeline for the latest issue of Index Medicus. Remember Index Medicus before the internet? You would do your searches in these tomes, which had collated every article published in medicine and the preclinical sciences, everything. So I would look up categories like lysergic acid diethylamide or hallucinogen to see what was the latest, what was being done. This would have been in mid-late 70s, and nothing of interest, no human studies at all.
Wow.
Maybe some preclinical stuff. I mean, you could, learn something about a reflex in a salamander, or the ocular effects in cats, but nothing addressing the human condition, which is what had so intrigued me. And there was no discussion in my medical school classes or rotations through psychiatry. It was as if the psychiatric research with hallucinogens had never occurred.
Wow.
That was the sense you had.
Well, that's probably still going on in many programs where it's not being discussed.
Right, but less and less so, because
less and less so.
The media is really jumping in, and they, as they were antagonistic towards the topic of psychedelics decades ago, they're now embracing it, almost going overboard, I think, at times. So, I mean, last Monday, we had a front page article in the New York Times.
Right.
Yeah, so, that was a big article. That was
a very big article. I think fairly revealing of the state of the field.
Sure. Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about, so what came next? So this was late 70s, 80s. Like, what came next in your trajectory around getting involved in the research?
So, in medical school, I honestly, I was disappointed in psychiatry. I felt they had turned their back on what had been a very exciting area to research, what had inspired me to go to medical school. And, I wasn't really caught up with mainstream psychiatry. I ended up going into internal medicine. You know, my father was an internist. This is how we connected, talking about cases, medical cases, and I liked learning how to be a doctor, and medicine seemed to be the core of being a doctor. And so I had some medical residency training. Then I felt it wasn't quite what I was looking for. I went into neurology, realized that was definitely not what I was looking for, and then finally made the jump into psychiatry. And that would have been around 1980 or so, the summer of 1980. And found a bookstore near my school that had a section on psychedelics. It was like another discovery. And new books by Stan Grof had just come out, LSD Psychotherapy. Lester Grinspoon's book, Psychedelics Rediscovered, came out in 1979. That was a very important book. So it was kind of rediscovering the literature. Again, pulled me in. But in the around 83, I transferred to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, where again there was, no one was doing any psychedelic studies. This was long before Roland Griffiths started to do the kind of work that he became well known for. The chairman at Johns Hopkins was very antagonistic towards any suggestion that psychedelics should be explored. But I had, I did finish my training there. I was on the faculty there, enjoyed it very much, but felt a pull to come back out to the West Coast. And it really had a lot to do with my old vision of working with psychedelics. I felt Hopkins would be too restrictive, and I was in too junior a role to have any say about doing anything as controversial as that. So I went out. I was recruited by a few places. I took an offer at UC Irvine, and there in the late 80s, right, 87, 88, I met Roger Walsh, who was a senior professor, highly respected, one of the major psychiatrists in the world of transpersonal psychology and psychiatry. And he, I spoke with him about my old interest in psychedelics and said how unfortunate it was that it didn't appear this was going to go anyplace. And he said, au contraire, I think this is a really important area. I resonate with your interests, and if you've got the determination to jump in there, I'd urge you to, write a review paper, write a case study, write a protocol. So he was encouraging me to get into the field. Then I made the acquaintance of one of the other guys on the junior faculty at UC Irvine, Gary Bravo, and he strongly connected with my visions about psychedelics. He had very similar, wish to work in this area. So we collaborated. We then made a connection with anthropologists who lives down here, Marlene Dobkin-de-Rios, who did a lot of the early work on ayahuasca use in Peru, and really contributed a number of outstanding publications to the field of the anthropological perspective on psychedelics. She passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but she was also a big kind of provided a lot of encouragement. So, my experience was basically, I got my credentials, I established myself in the field, and then I started to talk about my interests, and some senior people understood what I was talking about, agreed with my premise and with my goals, and strongly encouraged me to speak up, to write, to accept speaking engagements, to submit protocols, which is what happened. It took a long time. I got very old in the process. I didn't start off with a white beard, but it was what it was, and still going on.
In those early years, was it difficult to get an IRB to look at a protocol on psychedelics?
Well, they'd look at it, but then they'd shoot it down.
I see.
Often very quickly. So remember when I submitted a protocol for what turned out to be my first study administering a psychedelic. Actually, it was MDMA. When I first set my protocol into the IRB at Harbor UCLA, where I've been for the last 28 years, this is when I just first got there. No one knew me from anyone else. I presented a protocol on MDMA. They didn't know what to do with it. So they did the expected. They shot it down very quickly. So, so I spoke with the head of the IRB, who suggested that I attend the next meeting and describe what the rationale of the study was, what we plan to do, safety parameters, and answer whatever questions that, or concerns they might have. So I did that. I spent about an hour, I think, with the committee going over the history of the field. And then a few days later, the head of the IRB called me up and he said, "Well, Charles, I have good news and bad news." I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "Well, the good news is the committee has unanimously approved your protocol." That was a big relief. Well, so, but what's the bad news? Well, you may not consider it bad news, but the committee would also like to invite you to join the IRB as a committee member, which I had to accept. But this is a huge commitment of time and energy, which, I did it for over 10 years. I was a vice chair for a while of the committee, so, and then I rotated off. But that was the price I had to pay.
You got to do what you got to do.
And I've had a lot of support at Harbor UCLA. The research institute here is called Lundquist Research Institute. Previously it was LA Biomed. They've been, they've been very supportive, and I think they get it what I'm trying to do. And now it's becoming so well known publicly and approved of. One would think that I think they feel the bet is paying off for them.
Well, I'm curious what's happening currently with research at the center.
Well, what I'm doing at this point is putting together a new protocol. I'm working closely with Tony Bassis and Brian Anderson, putting together. And we actually previously worked with someone in the palliative field, Ira Byock, who had a big impact on our on our process. But we're putting together a multi-site study which would involve studying the use of a psilocybin treatment model in the palliative care setting with people approaching the end of life who had severe reactive demoralization, existential anxiety, kind of a follow-up on a previous study we did working with advanced cancer patients. Here we would open it up to other medical illnesses beyond cancer as well, if there was if there was a limited life expectancy and people were already enrolled in a palliative program. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a practical approach. It's calling it a pragmatic approach, because part of the study will involve training palliative care practitioners in how to administer the treatment.
Training is such a big issue. Getting people trained. I mean, when I think about people like you and Michael and Annie Mithofer and some of the other folks who have been providing assisted therapies, whether it's psilocybin or MDMA, for a couple decades. One of the things that's challenging from my perspective is how do we get people up to a very high level of competency in a much shorter period of time to meet this bottleneck?
It's a huge challenge because on the face of it, it looks like there may very well be opportunities to treat large numbers of patients. And we don't have a critical core of experienced experienced and credentialed facilitators. There's certainly has been a very active underground, and some of these practitioners are very, very capable. Right. But then not all are. And what kind of process is going to have to be put into place to figure out who who's appropriate for this task and who's not. So that's there are a lot of important kind of structural decisions and determinations are going to have to be made over the next year or two. I mean, we've got Oregon, which is they decriminalize. I believe there's a time lag, which is good, but I believe the state's supposed to come up with a system as to what kind of oversight on psychedelic psychotherapy could be provided. And honestly, I don't know where the state is in that process.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because psychotherapy hasn't faced this before, in the sense that there's never been sort of a new modality that gets unleashed overnight, and now we need, thousands of practitioners in that modality overnight. Like, that's never happened in this way before. So it's a very interesting road we're at in the field of psychotherapy. We have a whole new wave of psychotherapy that's coming within years, and we need, tens of thousands of practitioners trained.
That's right. No, I don't know how we're going to be able to create this this critical mass of facilitators. It's just not going to be possible. So we'll have to see how the process goes. If the phase 3s are as successful as the earlier phase studies, and if the regulatory agencies and Congress also move to reschedule these compounds, opening them up, what kind of what would credentials look like? What kind of background would an individual need? What kind of prior experience? Would it be open up to just about anyone, or would it be opened up to individuals who were already health or mental health professionals who had an active clinical license of one sort or another?
Right. Yeah, lots of unanswered questions.
What?
Lots of unanswered questions.
Yeah. I don't have the answers. I know I know some of the questions, but I don't have a lot of the answers.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely, our institute has a program right now that we're enrolling in and getting people trained in. So we have a training. I didn't know if you were aware of that. That we're trying to address this issue. It's a big issue, but it's also an exciting issue, obviously, because this is a whole new wave of a healing modality.
Right.
It's very exciting. So I'm curious about going back to the research for a second for you. A lot of the research is really focused on, we could say, mental health disorders and, really this medical examination into how these medicines could help people. I'm curious, like, some of your excitement that you probably had from the beginning of, like, what is the types of research, research programs you would really want to get deeply into to see, like, what do these substances actually do? And like, what are a lot of the thoughts that go around in your head about what do we need to research with these substances?
Yeah. Well, I've always been a believer that the best indications for a psychedelic treatment model are those conditions which do not respond well to conventional treatments.
Yeah.
So, at the top of that list, I'd say, treatment of chronic alcohol abuse. Medicine still does relatively poorly treating alcoholics. If an alcoholic walked into your office, you probably refer them to a 12-step group. And if it's a good fit, that can be it. That could really help propel them into a much healthier lifestyle. But with a lot of people, it's not the right fit. So what else is there for them? Right. The work with alcoholics dating back to Humphrey Osmond in the late 50s in Canada has been remarkably positive and easy to measure. There are people who are either drinking or not drinking. So that's an area I would like to see, we should invest a lot into studying. And there is a good study now at NYU with Michael Bogenschutz. He was formerly at the University of New Mexico and moved to study at NYU. And he's getting some, I think, some good data. Another area would be the kind of work that I've done, working with people at the end of life. Stan Grof, Walter Pankey, Eric Cass, Gary Fisher, Sidney Cohen, Bill Richards. These guys had all been involved in treating people with terminal cancer, and really with very, very positive results in terms of enhancing quality of life in the remaining time, ameliorating the level of anxiety or mood disturbance, even healing, allowing patients to start to heal some relationship rifts they had with significant others. It was a whole ripple effect of really therapeutic outcome. That's an area as well. So we did our study in the early 2000s with psilocybin and a population of advanced cancer patients, and we were quickly followed up with studies at Hopkins and at NYU. So it's good to see that happen. And now we're trying to really, catalyze more activity in that area. Other areas that psychiatry doesn't do well, eating disorders. That could be a challenging condition for a psychedelic model, and yet our conventional models, more often than not, fail. So again, another area that we should be looking into. The chronic PTSD work, often very tough, intractable disturbance. MAPS's work with MDMA has been quite impressive. I'd like to see classic psychedelics applied also, like a moderate dose level of psilocybin for chronic PTSD, I think would be very interesting. And then, moving even outside of the realm of psychiatric treatment, would be use in a religio-spiritual context. I spent some time in Brazil in the 90s and early 2000s studying one of the ayahuasca churches, the Unidade Vegetal. And I was very impressed with how they had incorporated, how they had evolved and the kind of ritual they had and how it facilitated, within the context of their culture, very, very positive outcomes in people who were joining their churches. I mean, I interviewed in depth quite a number of people in the UDV, and was very, very impressed with their accounts. Many of them had started at the bottom rungs of the socioeconomic ladder, very, very dysfunctional, substance problems galore, problems with aggression. Some of them had spent time in jail. They had entered this church, which used ayahuasca as a psychoactive sacrament twice monthly, and they had had transformative experiences. That's certainly something worth following up. Mm-hmm. Also, the work looking at effects on individuals who are in the criminal justice system. Peter Hendricks at Alabama has done some very good work looking at data from the Alabama prison system of drug use data before incarceration and then recidivism rates after release, and finding that exposure to psychedelics prior to incarceration was a predictor of a low recidivism rate down the line. I thought that was fascinating.
Wow.
And there have been some, good work periodically looking at the Santo Daime has a process in Brazil where they, at least for a while, were taking prisoners who were given passes to one of their ayahuasca retreat centers in the forest, and these guys would participate in all day or all evening ceremonies, be brought back to their prison the next day, and from the reports I read, had very positive outcomes. So there's I think a host of applications both within the medical or psychiatric treatment system, as well as outside with individuals who ostensibly don't have mental health issues, but want to use a psychedelic as part of the spiritual process.
Well, I'd like to ask you to speculate about something, which is sometimes a researcher, doesn't want to speculate too far ahead in the future. But what you're talking about in regards to, the application of periodic or maybe even single psychedelic session exposure for people who don't have a full-blown or diagnosable, DSM condition reminds me of the Bob Jesse comment about, the betterment of well people, and Michael Pollan proposing that at sometime in the future we might see mental health clubs where on your birthday you could go and have a psilocybin journey. to sort of clear out the cobwebs. Do you think that something like that is possible in
Sure.
our future?
Well, I think so. Perhaps not the immediate future, but I think so. I mean, back in the early 2000s, an ayahuasca case went to the Supreme Court. You know, I was the expert medical witness in this case because it involved the UDV, and a very conservative federal judge ruled in favor of the UDV to protect their freedom of religion rights. It got appealed to the appeals court in Denver, and then also subsequently to the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously that essentially healthy individuals who were part of a religion had the right to take a psychedelic sacrament, specifically ayahuasca, but other sacraments as well could conceivably be provided a legal test. Mm-hmm. So in that context, for sure. Mm-hmm. The work of Willis Harman, dating back to the mid-'60s, with James Fadiman, looking at how these compounds may facilitate creative problem solving. That they had some very intriguing early data. They unfortunately were shut down prematurely, but they were exploring potentials of how these compounds could be used outside of a treatment context. So I think there's certainly potential. The rate at which it will become feasible to explore this, who knows?
Right.
A lot of it will depend on how, obviously the use and treatment will be rolled out initially. It's going to be critical that this process go well, that subsequent studies, have strong safety data to report, that they've ensured strong safety parameters, they've ensured strong ethical parameters. It's going to be essential that, the field, the function of the field be optimized. And, if that happens, it will, I think, become more feasible for these compounds to be used in other facets of life.
Right.
With the overriding, structure that everything be done in an optimally safe manner.
Sure. Step by step.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to take a lot of public education. That really has to be an early step.
Which is now starting in a much bigger way with a lot of the media attention.
That's
right. Great. And I'm curious about what you would say. You mentioned at the beginning that you, very early on in college, you're like, hey, this might not be best to just keep doing this in a random way in the dormitory. I'm curious what now with all of this time you've had, like what are the kind of drawbacks of doing psychedelics in uncontained ways, set and setting isn't defined, versus what we can do by really controlling set and setting and kind of balancing those two stories. What have you learned here?
I think not only did the early pioneer researchers understand the value of set and setting, but if you look at indigenous structures, how they incorporated plant hallucinogens, it was all about set and setting. And the observation consistently over time has been the better you can control set and setting, the better the outcomes.
Right.
So I think it's going to have to be involved. We're going to have to involve an educative process where people need to understand that if you want to have a positive experience with a low likelihood of any adverse outcome, you do it in a safe context. You do it, let's say, in a contained space. You don't, dose someone and let them walk around the streets of a crowded city.
Right.
I can tell you about a case of a college student in a big East Coast city who didn't have a mental health history as far as was known, minimal psychedelic use background, seemingly impulsively on a weekend afternoon took some mushrooms and started walking through the streets of the city, seemingly got very disoriented, and no one is quite sure what happened, but he ended up jumping off of the side of a building on a high floor. So, and this was an example of a kid who didn't really understand the need to structure, the need to have a container, and the need to prioritize keeping things safe.
Yeah,
it's really. I think it's in the end, it's going to come down to that. One of the problems from the '60s was that too many kids were taking it, older people too, but mostly kids taking it in uncontrolled, unmonitored settings. And look, some of them had fabulous experiences that had a big impact on the subsequent course of their lives in a positive way. But some of these kids, most likely the more vulnerable ones to begin with, got pushed off the edge. Most of these kids kind of clawed back to some semblance of normalcy and were able, hopefully, to learn from something like that. But some stayed in a terribly decompensated state for really for years, if not the remainder of their lives. It's what's your sense of when people in an uncontrolled environment and they get very decompensated? Is that have to do with a trauma history? Does that have to just do with, like, what's your sense these days of just why that decompensation might happen? Well, again, it's really important to know what someone's baseline vulnerabilities are. Then you may be able to predict who would be at higher risk. So certainly the existence of prior trauma could be a predictor of rough outcome. What's going on around the individual. If suddenly the space is intruded upon by outside forces, and it can have a very kind of disorienting, scrambling kind of impact. People could get just thrown off of they're being grounded and kind of lose themselves in a swirl of intrapsychic activity. They could become quite confused and start to act out impulses.
Right. I've seen a number of folks in my practice, in my psychiatry practice, who had what I would call psychedelic trauma from, taking a compound at a festival and then either getting very paranoid, just as a part of maybe what's happening inside of their journey, inside of their mind, but also in the interaction with this destabilizing, swirling environmental effect, and sometimes getting involved with law enforcement, which
that's a disaster when that happens.
It's just horrible. Yeah, it's horrible. Yeah. So I agree with you. I think there's a huge public education need here.
I think instead of there's this tendency to look at these compounds as being used in a recreational manner. This is problematic. Recreation is all about fun. It could also mean mixing it with other drugs or alcohol, another recipe for disaster. So, I kind of forgot where I was going with that.
Well, I think you're speaking to the context of these medicines being used in a recreational setting.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, that's a very different it's sort of like any medicine, right? Like certain medicines are designed for certain settings. There's medicines that are designed for surgery. You're not going to, they're not designed to be taken in different contexts. So I think you're speaking to the context.
So I see these compounds, there's a therapeutic application and there's an application in a religious spiritual context as well. But again, when people just do it to have fun, to party, to have weird experiences. I remember I was at an event one night where one individual said, this is an ayahuasca session. He said his intention was to experience the dark side. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be a long night. And it was. He completely decompensated, had to be carried out of the room, kicking and screaming. Yeah, I ran into this guy months later. It was interesting, and I'd imagine he might have had some permanent decompensation. But what he said was shortly after this experience, which was a very sobering, humbling experience for him, he had met someone with whom he said he had established since then the most meaningful relationship that he had had. So there was a positive outcome, but one would never have known it given his behavior and his experiences that the night of the session.
That's a tough prayer. You got to be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, intention. Individuals thinking through their intention ahead of time, I think, is very, very important, and sometimes gets lost in all the commotion.
Yes.
But really focus and even write it out, talk it out. What do you hope to get out of this? Are there issues of healing, decisions you need to make, need to reflect on old experiences? Whatever it is, spell it out to yourself or talk it out with a friend or a therapist, because more often than not, that intention comes back and becomes integral to the experience. You may not become aware of it until afterwards, looking back, but it often plays a key role. So giving time and consideration to intention. Why do you want to have this experience, and why at this time, and why in this context, I think is important and often gets overlooked.
Here. Yeah, I agree. Well, let's talk a little bit about this this new handbook that just came out.
Oh, right. Oh, good. Thank you for raising that.
Tell us about the idea behind the book and why you decided to put that together.
Right. So along with Jim Grigsby, I was approached by a publisher a few years ago, Guilford Press, to essentially edit what I believe is the first formal textbook on psychedelics or hallucinogens, however you want to call them. So we have, and our sense was this field is on the cusp of really taking off. There's incredible potential that's been, kind of kept under wraps for decades, and now, the covers are being lifted. It's going to really get out there, and there's going to be a need for information. Mm-hmm. And this is going to be a topic taught in schools, particularly graduate schools, medical schools, psychiatric training. So in any event, the publisher at Guilford was very eager that we take on this project, and we felt we could do a good job. So we pulled together 30 different chapters, different writers and writing teams looking at the common hallucinogens, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, as MDMA, ketamine, salvia, ibogaine, and then applications, separate chapters and applications. It's used with substance use disorders, specifically with alcoholism, working in a palliative setting, treating depression, and then some other issues like the role of music or some philosophical considerations. So it was released by Guilford in March. Publication was delayed because of the pandemic. As it turns out, the high-grade paper they're reliant upon is from South Asia or Southeast Asia, where the supply chain issues arose because of the pandemic. So there was paper shortages. So everything got pushed back about 6 months. But we published in March, and it's been very well received. Sales are very good. They're going to, we've got it out in a hardcover version, which I think, presents very well. And the plan is to, by the end of the year, to have a softcover version as well, a paperback. So it's a large book. I think it's upwards to 700 pages. It's a tome. It's heavy. Don't want to carry more than 2 or 3 at a time. I found that.
It's comprehensive, that's for sure.
I think we've covered a lot of material. Yeah. And we got some great writers. David Nichols, Dennis McKenna. They had the first 2 chapters. They kind of anchor the book, and they're the experts in each of their specific fields, pharmacology and ethnobotany, and that's the foundation for all of this.
Beautiful. Yeah.
So the chapter is also on the history. Maria Mangini did a really lovely long chapter looking at historical issues.
It's really helpful to have all of that information in one place. Even in the age of the internet, it's well, in some ways, the internet is difficult to navigate because it's hard to actually tell what's. Sometimes separating the wheat from the chaff is not so easy.
Yeah. Here, it's the individual authors have already curated the information for the reader. They're presenting what's been distilled down as the most essential information to be aware of.
Right. Kind of a setting curated by the authors for the reader.
Right. There you go. Right.
Yeah. Well, this is so great to connect with you, Charlie. I really appreciate all the work that you've done and continue to do in the field, and your leadership and your heart too is really exceptional. And just so grateful for the energy that you bring to this work.
Well, thanks. I've been fascinated really ever since I was a kid, and was fortunate enough to come across, people more senior than me who gave me a lot of encouragement to keep, moving down this path and speaking up. If I felt this strongly, I should feel empowered to speak my mind. And I do it now. A lot of people are speaking up now, but they supported me in speaking up early on when it was still a taboo topic. And, it's been very gratifying for me. I've benefited personally from my acquaintance with various psychedelics and working with them, being able to manifest a dream I had going back, some almost 50 years. That's been very special.
Beautiful. Thank you for being on the show with us.
Sure. Well, really, really good talking with you guys.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we didn't ask our last question.
We forgot.
Do you want to ask that?
Sure. Sorry, I missed that. So we have a standard question we ask every guest, Charlie, as we wrap up, which is if you had a billboard that you could put a few sentences on that everyone in the world would see once in their life, what would you put on the billboard?
Oh, related to this topic?
Anything you want.
Anything. Be kind to your brothers and sisters. And be kind to all beings. And love will prevail.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. All righty.
Thank you so much.
Good enough.
Great connecting with you.
Good talking with you.